I don't know if you noticed any odd about that title. That is the almost final stage of the proofs of Animal Farm, and that of 1948.84. It was sensibly in error, fortunately, just before publication, and I noticed they put the size of the type into the title. Now, I don't know if you can really see that. Can you just about read it? Those are just a section from A Clergyman's Daughter. You notice a lot of the lines have the letters missing. This became an intractable problem, and edition after edition went through where different letters were missing from different lines. There at the top is a formula you may not recognise, which was in the final proof of 1984, 2R29(5-), which had also been missed. And down below, how proofs appeared from when they were printed in America at one stage, where the accents were written in between pointed brackets. The only advantage of that was it was very easy to find them. And the last one there, if you can see that, 2 + 2 = blank. The explanation for this is from the Penguin edition of 1954, and it's taken from the second hardback edition of Second Warburg. And what had happened was that 2 + 2 = 5, the 5 dropped out. It was set in what was called hot metal, monotype, and a little piece of type worked loose and dropped out. It wasn't noticed for 40 years. And this meant that scholars in England interpreted this to mean that Winston Smith had reservations about this formula. In America, of course, which a different text was printed, so it was printed from the carbon copy of Orwell's typescript, the 5 remained, and so American scholars, of course, interpreted as 2 + 2 = 5. My English students would happily read American criticism and apply it to English texts, which, of course, didn't make sense at all. For those of you who may be still involved in this sort of thing, the same thing happened in the last act of The Murder in the Cathedral, where the texts for many years were totally different. Unsurprisingly, when the first 3 books were issued on the 4th of April 1986, 2 years late, they were riddled with errors. Only one reviewer noticed, D.J. Enright. Why were they riddled with errors? Well, the first excuse was given, it was done by the Northumberland Press, was that it was a radar of ships passing along the Tyne. My father had been a master mariner on the Tyne, he died in 1933, and I don't think there have been a lot of ships since then. Certainly it wasn't radar doing it. So the story was changed to saying it was the radios of passing taxis. This seemed to convince the people of Poland Street that the whole edition was pulped. You may have seen a similar thing happening only this week to Jonathan Franson's Freedom, where they've had the wrong copy printed, and those have had to be pulped. The first 3 volumes were pulped because the printers had mislaid the corrected copy and inserted the uncorrected copy, hoping no one would notice. That press has gone bankrupt. The second set of volumes came out without trouble. The third set of volumes were also pulped, although Second Warburg would never tell me why. Let me turn for a few moments to the facsimile of 1984. I was sent by Tom with my wife to negotiate with the man who then owned it, Dan Siegel, in Boston in the summer of 1982. One of the problems was to ensure that there was no fiasco like the Hitler diaries, which troubled poor old Hugh Trevor. There were countless delays in printing this too. I won't bore you with them. But eventually it was published in 1984, but at the very end of the year, and of course it unfortunately missed the US Book of the Month Club, and so before long they had a lot of copies which they couldn't get rid of, and they were pulped. You could in fact buy them for £4 a copy then, but I believe it costs a lot more now. There were German, Dutch and Italian editions, and the Italian edition has a very interesting introduction by Umberto Eco. You might just see that. That is the opening of 1984, a cold, blowy day in early April, and 1 million radios were striking 13. And you can see how Orwell has changed the text. This is a passage which is omitted from the book itself, or omitted it. And after Winston and Julia leave O'Brien's flat, they're not supposed to meet again, if you recall. And Julia waits for Winston, and the text says a little bit of it. It was almost dark outside. He walked rather dreamily in the direction of the tube station. The next moment, Julia's arms were clinging tightly around him. You see, I've broken my first order. But Orwell cut that out. And there you can see the date. April the 4th, yes. Originally, 1980. And then you can see a 2 by the side of the 80. Then up above it, underneath the 4, the 2 again, 1982, changed to 1984. So a lot of stories about why it's called 1984 need to take that into account, but they don't. Let me turn for a few moments to Animal Farm and 1984. The format of Animal Farm was suggested, as I'm sure you all know, by Orwell seeing a young boy directing a huge cart horse near where he lived at Wallington. In those days, of course, a cart horse symbolised the Trade Union Congress. Those are probably, some people disagree with this, but probably the original scenes that Orwell had in mind. The upper picture is Bury Farm near Wallington, which is the manor farm. It fits in various topographical details. And below, to the right, not a very good picture, but is the shed in which the animals held their meetings. And that was pretty well opposite where Orwell lived. That was from Manor Farm. Next year at Letchworth, they're going to perform Animal Farm, I believe, in that shed. The inspiration goes back much earlier, however, initially to Orwell's childhood. Beatrix Potter's Pigling Land. Orwell read this to Jacinta, the young girl he was very fond of when they were still children, and she was poorly, and twice over he read Pigling Land to her when she was ill. And you can see the way the animals, the pigs, are walking on their 2 feet, what is possibly one inspiration for this book. But secondly, and much more important, I suppose, the terror experience in Spain. Sir Richard Rees, when he arrived in Barcelona in 1937, talks about meeting Eileen, Orwell's wife, working in the offices of the ILP in Barcelona. She seemed absent-minded, preoccupied and dazed. As Orwell was at the front, I assumed that it was worry about him that was responsible for her curious manner. But when she began talking about the risk for me of being seen in the street with her, that explanation no longer seemed to fit. In reality, of course, as I realised afterwards, she was the first person in whom I had witnessed the effects of living under a political terror. Orwell, Eileen rather, was at the front line. There she is, just behind the machine gunner, and rather murkily up above her, very tall, is Orwell. That's on the front at Huesca. Eileen was not easily frightened. As she wrote to her mother, I thoroughly enjoyed being at the front. But that was a different kind of front terror, political terror. It's unbelievable, I think, that Eileen's living under a political terror was not communicated and shared by her husband. In Homage to Catalonia, describing the May events, Orwell refers to the horrible atmosphere of suspicion and hostility in their hotel. He goes on to explain, no one who was in Barcelona then, nor for 4 months later, will forget the horrible atmosphere produced by fear, suspicion, hatred, censored newspapers, crammed jails, enormous food queues, and prowling gangs of armed men. Orwell never knew that it was intended to put him and Eileen on trial in Valencia in 1938 as Trotskyist traitors. The documents only came to life much later on.